The moment I saw my 8-year-old niece fall backward onto the living room floor, I knew something in our family had already crossed a line that could never be quietly erased. The sound was not loud, not dramatic in the way movies would show it, but it carried a kind of sharp finality that made everyone in the room stop for half a second too long. My name is Rachel Collins, and I still remember exactly how the air in that house felt at that moment, thick and strangely suspended, as if even the walls were waiting to see how we would choose to define what just happened. My brother, Daniel Collins, was standing near the couch with his arms slightly raised in a posture that suggested both surprise and irritation, as if he was already preparing his version of events before anyone even asked. My niece, Emma, was 8 years old, small enough that the coffee table seemed too large beside her, and she was not crying immediately. Instead, she just sat there for a moment, staring down at the floor with a confused expression that felt heavier than tears. That silence from her hit me harder than anything else. It was the kind of silence children use when they are trying to understand something that does not make sense yet. My parents were in the room as well. My mother, Linda Collins, stepped forward first, her voice already shaped into calm before she even fully processed the scene. She probably just lost her balance, she said quickly, as if naming it that way could stabilize everything else in the room. My father, Robert Collins, stood behind her near the hallway entrance, his expression already tightening into something controlled and dismissive, the kind of look that tries to reduce chaos before it fully forms. He looked at Daniel again, waiting for him to explain what had just happened, but instead he shrugged slightly and let out a short breath, almost like the situation was already being exaggerated beyond what it really was. She was acting like a brat, he said casually, not even lowering his voice, as if the word belonged naturally in that moment. He felt something shift inside me at that exact second, not explosive, but steady and cold, like a realization forming before emotion could fully catch up to it. Emma finally moved her hand to her arm, rubbing it gently, still not crying, still not speaking, and that detail made everything feel more serious than any raised voice ever could. He stepped closer, slowly, not because I was trying to escalate anything, but because I needed to see her face clearly. Emma, are you okay? He asked quietly, but she did not answer right away. She just nodded once, uncertain, not fully committing to yes or no. Being me, I could hear my mother already continuing the explanation to herself rather than to anyone else. It was an accident, she said again, more firmly this time, as if repetition could turn uncertainty into fact. My father added nothing, but his silence carried agreement in a way that felt even more final than words. He turned slightly toward them, trying to understand how quickly the room had already begun rewriting what I had just witnessed. In less than a minute, the event was no longer an event. It was becoming a narrative, shaped and softened before it could even be questioned. Daniel walked past me toward the kitchen without looking back, as if his role in the moment had already been completed and dismissed. I stayed near Emma, watching her carefully as she slowly pushed herself up from the floor, her movements small and cautious. Something about the way no one fully stopped to address her directly, to ask her what she felt or what she experienced, stayed with me more than anything else that had happened. It was not just the fall. It was how quickly the truth of it began to disappear inside the comfort of family explanation. And in that silence that followed, I realized this was not the first time I had seen reality reshaped like this inside our home. The moment after Emma stood up from the floor, the room did not return to normal in the way my parents seemed to expect it would. Instead, it settled into something quieter but far more divided, as if the air itself had split into separate interpretations of the same event. I stayed close to Emma, watching her carefully as she adjusted her balance and slowly moved closer to the couch, her small hand still resting near her arm where she had fallen. She was not crying, and that absence of tears made the situation feel even more unsettling, because it suggested she was processing the moment internally rather than releasing it outwardly. My mother had already begun moving around the room again, returning to the rhythm of preparing things for dinner as if that activity could reset what had just happened. She is fine, she said again, more confidently now, almost as if confirming it for herself as much as for anyone else. My father remained near the hallway, his posture unchanged, observing the room with the same controlled detachment he always used when something needed to be categorized rather than questioned. Daniel was no longer in the living room, his presence having shifted into the kitchen without explanation, which somehow made his earlier words feel even more final, as if they had been delivered and then immediately filed away as resolved. He looked at Emma again, crouching slightly so I could be closer to her eye level. "Does it hurt?" he asked gently. She hesitated before giving a small shake of her head, but her expression did not fully match the answer. There was uncertainty there, not just about pain, but about whether she was allowed to fully express it. That detail stayed with me. It was not just what had happened, but how quickly the moment had been absorbed into the household's preferred version of events. My mother continued speaking in a softer tone now, addressing me rather than Emma. "Children fall all the time," she said, as if placing the incident into a general category would reduce its significance. "You know how Daniel is." It did not mean anything by it. The phrase "did not mean anything" lingered in my mind because it seemed to erase impact entirely, replacing experience with intention as the only factor that mattered. He stood slowly, still staying close to Emma, but turning slightly toward my mother. "He called her a name," I said quietly. My voice was not raised, but it was more direct than anything I had said earlier. My mother paused briefly, as if deciding whether that detail required acknowledgement. "He was frustrated," she replied after a moment. Her tone still calm, still structured, as if emotion could explain and therefore neutralize behavior. My father finally spoke from the hallway, his voice steady and firm. "This is being taken out of proportion," he said simply, not looking at either of us directly. "It was an accident. That is all." The word "accident" now felt like a boundary marker rather than an explanation, something being used to define what could and could not be discussed further. I looked toward Daniel's absence in the kitchen, then back at Emma, who had now moved to sit quietly on the edge of the couch, her feet not fully touching the floor. She was watching the room carefully, as if trying to understand which version of reality she was expected to accept. He realized then that no one was asking her what she had experienced. Nope, really. The conversation had already shifted away from her and into interpretation, as if her perspective was the least necessary part of the event. He sat down beside her again, not touching her, just remaining present. "If something hurt you, you can say it," I told her softly. She glanced at me briefly but did not respond. "Bem buesi." My mother continued organizing things on the counter, her movements steady and controlled, as if restoring order through routine. My father remained in the hallway, still watching but no longer engaging. And in that separation of responses, I began to recognize something I had not fully acknowledged before. It was not just that the family disagreed on what had happened. It was that the family had already agreed on how quickly it should be defined as something else entirely. After a few minutes of what appeared to be quiet restoration of normal household activity, the atmosphere in the house had not truly returned to normal at all, but instead had shifted into a layered stillness where everyone seemed to be operating within their own interpretation of the same moment. He remained seated beside Emma on the couch, maintaining a calm presence so she would not feel alone in the space, but also observing the way the rest of the house continued to function as if nothing significant had occurred. My mother was now fully engaged in preparing the kitchen for what she called getting things back on track. Moving plates and utensils with deliberate organization, as if structure itself could override emotional residue. My father had moved further into the hallway, occasionally glancing into the living room but not re-entering the conversation. Daniel had not returned to the room at all. Emma remained quiet beside me, her posture slightly withdrawn, her hands resting in her lap. She was no longer reacting outwardly, but her stillness felt different from earlier. It was not the stillness of observation anymore. It was the stillness of processing something that had not been given language. He noticed that she occasionally glanced toward the kitchen, as if trying to understand whether the environment around her had fully accepted what had happened or whether it was still in a state of negotiation. My mother eventually spoke again, this time without looking directly at me. "It is not helpful to keep revisiting it," she said, her tone calm but firm, as if she was setting a boundary around conversation itself. "Emma is fine now. That is what matters." He looked at Emma briefly before responding. "What happened matters too," I said quietly. There was no escalation in my voice, but the words felt heavier in the space than anything else that had been said since the incident. My father, still near the hallway, responded without stepping forward. "You are turning this into something it is not," he said, his tone controlled and final. It was a moment. "It is already over." The phrase "already over" did not match what I was seeing in Emma, but I noticed how quickly that phrase was being used as a tool to close interpretation rather than engage with it. He turned slightly toward him. "It is not over for her," I replied. My mother paused her movements in the kitchen for a moment, then continued as if deciding not to engage further. "Children recover quickly," she said instead, almost as a general principle rather than a response to what I had said. He looked back at Emma, who had now shifted slightly closer to me again without speaking. She was not asking for attention, but she was staying within proximity, as if presence itself was more reliable than explanation. He realized that no one had asked her directly what she felt or how she experienced what happened. Note 11. The conversation had been entirely about interpretation from the perspective of adults, filtered through assumptions about intention, proportion, and correction. Daniel's words had already been reduced to context rather than content, and Emma's experience had been placed beneath that context without being addressed on its own terms. He gently adjusted my position so I was sitting more directly beside her rather than slightly in front of her, creating a clearer sense of alignment in space. She did not resist that adjustment. Instead, she remained still, her gaze directed toward the floor in front of her. My father finally spoke again from the hallway, his tone unchanged. "We are not going to escalate this further," he said. "It is not necessary." The word escalate framed the situation as something that required containment rather than understanding. He realized then that the structure of this household did not primarily process events through emotional acknowledgement. It processed them through resolution categorization. Something either required action or it did not, and once it was placed into the category of not necessary, it ceased to be actively engaged. I looked at Emma again, noticing how quietly she remained within that structure, not because she accepted it, but because she had not been given another framework within which to express herself. That realization stayed with me longer than anything else in the room. He understood then that the disagreement in this house was not just about what had happened on the floor a short time ago, it was about whether her experience would be allowed to exist as its own form of truth or whether it would continue to be redefined until it fit the structure everyone else had already agreed upon. The evening had moved further along, and the house had settled into a quieter rhythm that no longer resembled the earlier tension-filled moment, yet still carried its invisible weight beneath every surface interaction. He remained beside Emma on the couch, maintaining a steady presence as she continued to sit in silence, her small frame slightly angled inward as if protecting herself from further interpretation of what had already happened. The rest of the household had resumed activity in ways that suggested closure, but not resolution. My mother continued in the kitchen, now speaking occasionally in a lighter tone to my father about unrelated matters, as if the earlier incident had been successfully compartmentalized into something no longer requiring attention. My father remained partially visible near the hallway entrance, occasionally observing but no longer participating in any discussion. Daniel still had not returned to the living room, and his absence had begun to feel like part of the structural design of the moment rather than a temporary withdrawal. Emma shifted slightly closer to me, not seeking comfort in an explicit way, but staying within proximity as if proximity itself was safer than language. I noticed how carefully she was regulating her own presence, minimizing movement, minimizing expression, as though she had already learned that reduced visibility was the most effective way to avoid further reinterpretation of her experience. He leaned slightly toward her and spoke gently. "You do not have to stay quiet if something is bothering you," I said. She did not respond verbally, but her eyes moved briefly toward the kitchen before returning downward. That small movement carried more meaning than any words she could have chosen in that moment. My mother eventually re-entered the living room area carrying a tray, placing it on the table with controlled efficiency, and then speaking in a tone that suggested closure rather than continuation. "Everything is fine now," she said, as if restating the conclusion would reinforce its stability. My father added nothing but gave a short confirming nod, reinforcing the same boundary without verbal expansion. I looked at them both, then back at Emma, and realized that the definition of fine in this environment was not aligned across perspectives. For the adults in the room, fine meant the absence of ongoing disruption. For Emma, it was not clear whether anything had been resolved at all. He felt a growing awareness that what was being prioritized here was not emotional clarity but structural stability. If the household could return to functional normalcy, then the event was treated as resolved regardless of internal impact. He turned slightly toward my mother. "She was pushed," I said calmly, not as accusation, but as clarification of an unaltered fact. My mother paused briefly, then replied in a measured tone. "It was an accident between children interacting," she said, reinforcing the same framing that had already been introduced earlier. My father stepped slightly forward from the hallway, his voice steady and firm. "We are not going to assign blame where there is none," he said. The phrase assign blame reframed the entire situation into something procedural rather than experiential, as if emotional impact could be invalidated through terminology. He looked back at Emma again. She was still, but her stillness now carried a subtle shift, a kind of internal withdrawal that suggested she was no longer attempting to interpret the responses around her. She was simply existing within them. That realization felt heavier than any disagreement occurring between the adults. He understood then that the conflict in the room was no longer about the physical moment that had occurred earlier. It was about whether Emma's internal experience would be acknowledged as valid information or whether it would continue to be filtered through a system that prioritized restoration of normalcy over recognition of impact. My mother returned to the kitchen again, continuing to organize objects that no longer needed organizing. My father resumed his position near the hallway, maintaining distance but authority through presence alone. And I remained on the couch beside Emma, aware that I was now positioned between two competing interpretations of reality that could not be reconciled through repetition alone. In that quiet space, I began to understand that the most significant divide in this household was not about what had happened, but about whether what happened required acknowledgement at all. The house had entered a stage of the evening where physical movement continued but emotional acknowledgement had largely stalled, creating a contrast between surface normalcy and underlying unresolved tension that no one was directly addressing. He remained seated beside Emma on the couch, noticing that she had not moved much in the past several minutes, except for small adjustments in posture that suggested she was trying to maintain stability without drawing attention to herself. The adults in the household had fully transitioned into what they considered a restored routine. My mother was still in the kitchen, now speaking occasionally in a conversational tone with my father about unrelated matters, as if returning to normal topics could reinforce the idea that the earlier situation had been properly contained. My father remained near the hallway, occasionally looking into the room with a calm, measured expression that suggested he believed the matter had reached its conclusion. Daniel had still not returned to the space, and his absence had now become a silent confirmation of the separation between what had happened and what was being allowed to remain present in conversation. Emma shifted slightly again beside me, this time pulling her knees closer to her body in a quiet, protective posture that did not appear directed at anyone, but rather at the environment itself. He noticed that she was not looking toward the kitchen or hallway anymore. Her gaze was directed downward, steady but distant, as if she had stopped expecting clarification from the people around her. That change felt significant because it marked a transition from confusion into internal withdrawal, not dramatic, but gradual and contained. I leaned slightly closer and spoke in a calm voice. You do not need to stay silent about what you feel, I said again, not as instruction, but as an opening. She did not respond, but her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of her sleeve, a small movement that suggested she was still processing internally rather than disengaging entirely. My mother eventually entered the living room again, placing a folded cloth on the arm of the chair with deliberate efficiency, and speaking in a tone that suggested finality rather than continuation. We have already addressed it, she said, her words carefully neutral. My father followed shortly after, standing near the doorway with the same controlled posture he had maintained throughout the evening. There is nothing further to discuss, he added, reinforcing the boundary around the topic. He looked at both of them and realized that what they were defining as closure was actually a form of containment, not resolution. It required silence from the affected party in order to remain stable. He turned my attention back to Emma, who had now shifted slightly closer to me again without speaking. Her proximity was subtle, not seeking attention, but indicating that she was still orienting herself within the space based on where she felt least exposed. That realization made it clear to me that she was adapting to the emotional environment rather than being supported within it. He spoke gently again. You are allowed to say if something did not feel okay, I said. She hesitated for a moment, then gave a very small movement of her head, not fully a nod, not fully a refusal. It was uncertain, but it was the first visible indication that she was still processing meaning rather than accepting closure. My mother resumed speaking to my father about logistical matters, her tone steady, reinforcing the return to routine. My father responded briefly, maintaining distance from the conversation about the earlier event. The structure of the household was visibly re-establishing itself, but it was doing so by isolating the incident rather than integrating it. He began to see more clearly that the disagreement in the room was not about whether something had happened, but about whether what happened required acknowledgement beyond the moment it occurred. Emma remained beside me, quiet and small in posture, but no longer reacting outwardly to the adult conversation around her. In that silence, I understood that the most important part of the moment was not what had been said, but what had been left unaddressed, and how quickly that absence was being accepted as resolution. The evening had settled into a quieter phase where conversation had largely fragmented into separate spaces within the same house, each carrying its own version of what had happened earlier without ever fully intersecting again. He remained seated beside Emma on the couch, aware that she had become increasingly still over time, not in a relaxed sense, but in a way that suggested she was conserving expression rather than engaging with the environment. My mother continued moving through the kitchen with deliberate organization, occasionally speaking in a casual tone that avoided any reference to the earlier incident, as if consistency and routine could replace the need for acknowledgement. My father remained near the hallway entrance, maintaining his usual posture of controlled observation, occasionally glancing toward the living room but not re-entering the conversation in any meaningful way. Daniel had still not returned, and his absence now felt like a fixed element of the environment rather than a temporary withdrawal. Emma shifted slightly closer to me again, this time resting her arms more tightly against her body, a small adjustment that suggested she was seeking stability through posture rather than interaction. He noticed that she was no longer looking toward the adults in the room. Her attention had narrowed inward, away from interpretation and away from expectation. That shift felt important because it marked a transition from trying to understand the situation externally to simply enduring it internally. He leaned slightly toward her and spoke softly. You are still safe to talk about what happened, I said, keeping my tone calm and steady. She did not respond verbally, but her breathing changed slightly, a subtle sign that she was still processing rather than disengaging completely. My mother entered the living room briefly, placing a small object on the table and speaking in a tone that suggested completion. We are moving on from this, she said, not as a discussion point, but as a conclusion already decided. My father followed with a brief statement from the hallway. There is no further issue here, he added, reinforcing the same boundary of interpretation. He looked at both of them and realized that what they were defining as resolution was not based on emotional understanding, but on structural closure. If the household functioned again without disruption, then the event was considered resolved regardless of its internal impact on anyone involved. I turned my attention back to Emma, who had now shifted even closer, not seeking physical comfort, but positioning herself in a way that reduced exposure to the wider room. Her posture suggested adaptation rather than recovery. She was learning, within a short span of time, how to exist in an environment where her experience was not being actively engaged by the adults around her. That realization stayed with me because it revealed a deeper layer of what was happening in the house beyond the surface disagreement. It was not just a difference in interpretation of one event. It was a difference in whether her internal experience was considered relevant to the narrative being constructed around her. He spoke again, more gently. "You do not have to agree with what others say happened," I said. She did not respond, but her fingers moved slightly against her sleeve, a small but noticeable sign of internal tension rather than acceptance. My mother resumed speaking with my father in the kitchen about unrelated matters, her voice steady and controlled, reinforcing the return to normal structure. My father remained in the hallway, no longer engaging with the living room. The household continued functioning, but the earlier moment had not been integrated into that function. It had been separated and contained, allowed to exist only as something already resolved. He understood then that the real divide in the room was not about the incident itself, but about whether Emma's experience of it would ever be acknowledged as part of the reality everyone else was already moving past. The house had entered a deeper stage of evening where the earlier event no longer existed as an active topic of conversation, yet continued to influence the behavior and emotional positioning of everyone in subtle and unspoken ways. He remained seated beside Emma on the couch, aware that she had become increasingly withdrawn into herself over time, not in a dramatic or visible breakdown, but in a quiet reduction of outward expression that suggested she was adapting to the environment rather than being supported within it. My mother continued in the kitchen, her movements steady and purposeful, occasionally speaking in a light tone to maintain the sense of normal household rhythm, as if routine itself could confirm that nothing significant remained unresolved. My father stood near the hallway entrance, occasionally glancing toward the living room but no longer engaging directly, maintaining the same controlled detachment he had shown throughout the evening. Daniel remained absent from the space entirely, and his absence had become part of the structure of the moment, no longer treated as unusual or requiring explanation. Emma shifted slightly closer to me again, this time without looking up, her posture small and contained, suggesting that she was minimizing her presence within the room rather than seeking interaction. I noticed that she no longer reacted to movement or conversation from the kitchen or hallway. Instead, she remained focused inward, as if external dialogue had become irrelevant to her current experience. He leaned slightly toward her and spoke softly. "You do not need to hold everything inside," I said, keeping my voice calm and steady. She did not respond, but her shoulders rose and fell in a subtle pattern that suggested she was still processing internally rather than disengaging completely. My mother eventually re-entered the living room briefly, adjusting an item on the table before speaking in a tone that implied closure rather than continuation. "Everything has been settled," she said, as if reaffirming a conclusion that required no further examination. My father followed shortly after, his voice coming from the hallway without him stepping fully into the room. "There is nothing more to discuss," he added, reinforcing the same boundary of interpretation that had been present since earlier in the evening. I looked at both of them and recognized that what they were defining as resolution was not based on understanding or emotional integration, but on the restoration of functional normalcy within the household structure. As the house returned to its expected rhythm, the event was considered complete, regardless of whether it had been processed by everyone involved. He turned my attention back to Emma, who had now shifted even closer to me without speaking, her body angled slightly inward in a way that reduced exposure to the rest of the room. Her behavior suggested not acceptance, but adaptation to an environment where her experience was not being actively acknowledged by the adults around her. That realization became increasingly difficult to ignore because it revealed that the disagreement in the room was not simply about interpretation of one event, but about whether her internal experience was considered relevant to the reality being maintained by the rest of the household. He spoke again gently. "You are allowed to say if something felt wrong to you," I said. She remained silent, but her hands tightened slightly in her lap, a small but clear indication of internal tension rather than resolution. My mother resumed speaking with my father in the kitchen about unrelated matters, her tone steady and composed, reinforcing the return to routine. My father remained near the hallway, no longer engaging with the living room. The household continued functioning in outward appearance, but the earlier moment had not been integrated into its emotional structure. It had been separated, contained, and effectively removed from active consideration. He remained beside Emma, aware that what had happened earlier was no longer being debated as an event, but as something already concluded by the adults in the room, even while its impact was still clearly present in the person who had experienced it most directly. The evening had reached a point where silence in the house no longer felt temporary, but structured, as if every room had settled into its own version of emotional containment without requiring agreement between them. He remained seated beside Emma on the couch, aware that she had become even quieter than before, not in a way that suggested recovery or calm, but in a way that suggested she had stopped expecting her experience to be reflected back by anyone else in the room. My mother continued in the kitchen, speaking occasionally to my father in a controlled and neutral tone that focused on ordinary topics, maintaining the appearance of restored normalcy as if continuity of routine could replace unresolved emotional impact. My father remained near the hallway, his presence steady but detached, occasionally observing the living room without stepping into it, reinforcing a boundary between acknowledgement and participation. Daniel had still not returned, and his absence now felt like a fixed part of the environment rather than a missing variable that required explanation. Emma shifted slightly again, this time leaning subtly toward me without looking up, her posture small and inward, suggesting that she was no longer engaging with the household dynamics but instead adapting to them by minimizing her presence within them. He noticed that she was no longer reacting to the sound of movement from the kitchen or hallway. Instead, she remained internally focused, as if external interpretation had become irrelevant to her current state. He leaned slightly closer and spoke softly. "You do not have to carry this by yourself," I said, maintaining a calm and steady tone. She did not respond, but her fingers tightened briefly in her lap, a small indication that she was still processing rather than shutting down completely. My mother eventually entered the living room briefly, adjusting an object on the table before speaking in a tone that suggested finality. "We have already moved past this," she said, framing the situation as something already concluded rather than ongoing. My father followed with a brief statement from the hallway. "There is no need to continue discussing it," he added, reinforcing the same boundary of interpretation that had been present throughout the evening. He looked at both of them and understood more clearly that what they were defining as resolution was not based on emotional processing, but on the restoration of household functionality. As long as the structure of daily life could resume without visible disruption, the event was considered complete within their framework, regardless of whether it had been emotionally resolved by those most directly affected. He turned my attention back to Emma, who had now moved slightly closer again, her body angled inward in a way that reduced her exposure to the room. Her behavior no longer suggested confusion, but adaptation, a quiet adjustment to an environment where her perspective was not being actively engaged by the adults around her. That realization carried a growing weight because it revealed that the divide in the room was not simply about differing interpretations of one incident, but about whether her internal experience was considered valid information within the family system at all. He spoke again gently. "If something did not feel right to you, it still matters," I said. She remained silent, but her posture shifted slightly, not away from me, but inward, as if she was holding something unspoken within herself rather than releasing it into the room. My mother resumed speaking with my father in the kitchen about unrelated matters, her tone steady and controlled, reinforcing the return to routine conversation. My father remained near the hallway, no longer engaging with the living room. The household continued functioning outwardly, but the earlier moment had not been integrated into its emotional structure. It had been isolated, contained, and effectively removed from active discussion. He remained beside Emma, fully aware that the adults in the room were no longer treating the incident as something ongoing, while the child who experienced it was still visibly carrying its weight in silence that had not been given space to become language. The house had fully settled into a late evening stillness where conversation no longer functioned as a shared space, but instead existed in separated layers that never fully intersected. He remained seated beside Emma on the couch, aware that she had now entered a deeper state of withdrawal, not emotional collapse, but a quiet internal closing off that suggested she had stopped expecting any external acknowledgement of her experience. My mother continued moving through the kitchen with deliberate routine, occasionally speaking to my father in a neutral tone that focused on everyday matters, reinforcing the idea that normal household structure had been restored. My father remained near the hallway, maintaining his position of controlled distance, occasionally observing the living room without entering it, as if presence alone was sufficient to maintain authority without participation. Daniel had still not returned, and his absence had become an accepted part of the room's structure rather than a pending explanation. Emma shifted slightly again beside me, this time leaning closer in a way that was almost imperceptible, her body language no longer seeking interaction but minimizing exposure within the environment. I noticed that she was no longer responding to movement or sound from the rest of the house. Instead, she remained internally focused, as if external interpretation had stopped being relevant to her immediate experience. He leaned slightly toward her and spoke softly. "You are not wrong for how you feel," I said, keeping my voice steady and calm. She did not respond verbally, but her posture tightened slightly, a subtle indication that she was still processing rather than disengaging completely. My mother eventually entered the living room once more, adjusting an item on the table and speaking in a tone that suggested closure. "This is over now," she said, as if stating it was enough to make it structurally true. My father followed shortly after, his voice coming from the hallway without him stepping forward. "There is no reason to continue this discussion," he added, reinforcing the same boundary that had been maintained throughout the evening. I looked at both of them and understood more clearly that what they were defining as resolution was not based on emotional integration, but on the restoration of functional normalcy within the household. As long as daily structure could resume without visible disruption, the event was considered complete within their framework. He turned my attention back to Emma, who had now shifted slightly closer again, her body angled inward in a way that reduced her visibility within the room. Her behavior no longer suggested confusion or active distress, but adaptation to an environment where her internal experience was not being actively acknowledged by the adults around her. That realization carried increasing weight because it revealed that the conflict in the room was not simply about differing interpretations of a single incident, but about whether her experience was considered valid input within the family system at all. He spoke again gently. "What happens still matters even if others say it does not," I said. She remained silent, but her hands moved slightly in her lap, a small sign of continued internal processing rather than acceptance of closure. My mother resumed speaking with my father in the kitchen about unrelated matters, her tone steady and controlled, reinforcing the return to routine conversation. My father remained near the hallway, no longer engaging with the living room. The household continued functioning outwardly, but the earlier moment had not been integrated into its emotional structure. It had been isolated, contained, and effectively removed from active discussion. He remained beside Emma, fully aware that while the adults in the room had already moved on within their own framework, the child at the center of the incident was still carrying its unresolved impact in the silence that had not yet been allowed to become understood or spoken.